Welcome to Sleepy Crimes. I am Anna, your host. Tonight, we drift into the shadows of the grand, mechanical dream of 2008, a place known as Robo Dreamland. Close your eyes and imagine the coast of Incheon, South Korea. It is a place where the heavy, salt-laden air of the Yellow Sea rolls in over the gray mudflats, carrying with it the scent of wet earth and ancient tides. In the late months of 2007, and the early dawns of 2008, this stretch of land was not just a coastal industrial zone. It was a canvas for a future that seemed to glow with an ethereal, neon light. The sky above the port city often hangs low, a soft blanket of charcoal and silver, and the wind whispers through the skeletons of cranes and shipping containers. But in that pivotal year, a new sound began to vibrate beneath the hum of the city. It was the sound of progress, the rhythmic pulse of 1,000 silver hearts beating in unison within the blueprints of visionaries. We are standing on the precipice of a new era, where the boundary between the organic and the synthetic begins to blur into a beautiful, shimmering haze. The announcement came like a thunderclap in a quiet room. In a grand hall filled with the sharp, rhythmic clicking of camera shutters and the soft rustle of silk suits, the vision of the world's first robot theme park was unveiled to a waiting world. The officials spoke of a place called Robot Land, a sprawling kingdom of chrome and circuitry to be built in the Cheongna International City. They spoke with a quiet, intense passion, their voices echoing off the polished marble floors. On the mahogany tables lay blueprints rolled out like sacred scrolls, revealing a landscape of metallic wonders. There were sketches of a horizon dominated by a giant, ironclad guardian, a building shaped like the legendary T1V, rising hundreds of feet into the gray sky. The air in the room felt thick with the smell of expensive ink and the electric charge of high-speed data. This was not merely an amusement park. It was a statement of intent, a declaration that the future would be forged in the factories and research labs of Incheon. The promise was intoxicating, a dream of a world where robots did not just serve humanity, but invited us into their own mechanical playground. To build such a dream, a river of currency began to flow toward the coast, a shimmering stream of investment that felt as limitless as the sea itself. The scale of the funding was staggering, a mountain of paper and digital promises totaling over 784 billion won. Imagine the weight of that investment, a figure so vast it seems to hum with its own internal energy. The national government reached out its hand to the local leaders of Incheon, and together they invited the giants of the private sector to join the dance. Names like Shinhan Bank and LG stood at the threshold, their coffers opening to pour nearly $700 million into the marshy soil of the free economic zone. It was a tri-level partnership, a web of finance woven so tightly that it seemed impossible for it to unravel. Every coin dropped into the bucket was a heartbeat of confidence. They predicted nearly 20,000 new jobs would bloom like wildflowers in the industrial dust, and that 3 million visitors would travel from across the globe every single year to witness the miracle of steel. The math was perfect, the logic was ironclad, and the wealth was real. The renderings of the park were a sensory feast, a collection of images that promised to turn the gray mudflats into a kaleidoscope of light. Imagine walking through the gates into a world where the water in the aquarium does not hold living fish, but silver, articulated creatures that glide through the depths with the quiet whirring of tiny motors. Their scales are made of polished aluminum, reflecting the soft glow of underwater lamps. Above you, a roller coaster does not simply run on tracks. It is held aloft by the massive, articulated hands of a robotic giant, its fingers closing gently around the rails as it plunges into a pool of cooling water. There were to be stadiums where robots competed in tests of strength and agility, their hydraulic joints hissing as they moved with a grace that felt almost human. The architects described shopping malls where mechanical cashiers would greet you with a perfect, unwavering smile, and hotels where the very walls were embedded with artificial intelligence, sensing your needs before you could even whisper them. It was a vision of a total environment, a seamless fusion of research, education, and pure, unadulterated fantasy. As the sun set over Incheon in those early days of 2008, the residents of the city looked toward the horizon with a sense of quiet awe. They saw the vacant lots and the salt-crusted earth, but in their minds, they saw the glint of the sun on 1,000 metallic surfaces. They felt the vibration of the future beneath their feet, a low, steady frequency that promised stability and wonder. The excitement was a physical presence, a warmth that countered the biting winter chill coming off the water. Everyone believed. The graduate students dreamed of the labs where they would teach machines to think. And the children dreamed of the robotic giraffes they would ride on a carousel that never grew tired. The vision of steel was complete, a masterwork of human ambition and technological hope. But as the tide began to pull back from the shore, leaving the mudflats exposed and cold, the first shadows of uncertainty began to stretch across the blueprints. For now, however, the dream is still bright. The lights are still on in the planning offices, and the money is still flowing like a golden tide. Rest now, and let the image of that silver city settle in your mind. We are at the beginning of the dream, where everything is possible, and the steel is still warm to the touch. The transition from the warmth of the early year to the brittle, biting cold of late 2008 was more than just a change in season for the city of Incheon. It was a shift in the very gravity of the world's economy. As the winds began to whip across the Yellow Sea, carrying a sharp, salt-laden chill that rattled the glass panes of the high-rise offices, a different kind of frost was settling over the ambitious plans for Robo Dreamland. The global financial crisis had begun to tighten its grip, and the once vibrant flow of capital was slowing to a sluggish, icy crawl. Within the quiet rooms of the Special Purpose Corporation tasked with bringing the robot theme park to life, the atmosphere changed from one of frantic creation to a heavy, suffocating stillness. The walls, painted a clinical, modern white, seemed to close in as the staff turned their attention away from architectural blueprints and toward the dense, imposing stacks of financial ledgers that sat like leaden weights upon their desks. In one particular office, tucked away at the end of a long, carpeted hallway where the scent of burnt coffee and ozone from the laser printers hung thick in the air, the first subtle cracks began to show. An auditor, his eyes weary and strained under the flicker of dying fluorescent tubes, traced a finger down a column of figures. The paper was heavy, a high-quality bond that felt ironically substantial compared to the ephemeral nature of the numbers printed upon it. He noticed a discrepancy, a small, almost negligible amount of money, perhaps only a few $1,000s, that had been redirected from a land grading contract to a consulting firm with a name so generic it seemed designed to be forgotten. This was the first thread. It was a minor snag in a vast tapestry, but as he pulled at it, the fabric of the project began to unravel. He could hear the low, rhythmic hum of the building's ventilation system, a sound that usually faded into the background, but now seemed to pulse with an accusatory beat, echoing the uneasy rhythm of his own heart. The ledger was a labyrinth of lies, meticulously constructed to hide the truth behind a facade of progress. As the autumn of 2008 deepened, the movement of capital became increasingly frantic and nonsensical. Funds intended for the construction of the massive robot research tower were instead siphoned into a series of smaller, secondary accounts, belonging to subcontractors who existed only on letterheads and in the digital shadows of offshore bank records. The auditor found himself surrounded by the physical evidence of this deception. Manila folders bursting with invoices for steel that was never delivered, receipts for engineering consultations that never occurred, and wire transfer confirmations that led in circular loops, eventually returning to the same mysterious source. The air in the room felt thin, as if the very oxygen was being consumed by the growing weight of the fraud. Outside, the sky was a bruised shade of purple, the sun setting behind a horizon of cranes that stood motionless, like skeletal giants guarding a graveyard of broken dreams. There was a specific quality to the silence in the office during those late hours, a silence that was not peaceful, but pregnant with the unsaid. He could smell the faint, metallic scent of the ink on the pages, a smell that reminded him of old coins. The suspicious movement of capital was not just a matter of missing money. It was a betrayal of the city's collective hope. The subcontractors, many of whom were linked by tangled webs of shared addresses and directors, were acting as conduits, moving millions of dollars away from the site of Robo Dreamland and into the private coffers of those who had seen the financial crisis not as a tragedy, but as a cover. As the global markets crumbled and banks in New York and London fell, the architects of this ledger used the chaos as a smoke screen. Each time a major financial institution collapsed, another layer of complexity was added to the books, burying the truth deeper beneath a mountain of technical jargon and fabricated losses. He spent nights staring at the same page until the ink seemed to bleed and swim before his eyes. The ledger recorded land prices that shifted like sand, inflated by artificial demand and backroom deals that left the Incheon City Corporation struggling to justify the costs. The conflict over these prices became a primary source of the project's long, agonizing drift. Money flowed out to secure parcels of earth that would never see a foundation poured, while the actual workers, the engineers and visionaries who believed in the robot cluster, found their budgets slashed and their contracts frozen. The auditor felt the coldness of the desk through his sleeves, a hard, unyielding surface that offered no comfort. He realized then that the ledger was not a record of what had been built, but a map of what had been stolen. The lies were not just in the numbers. They were in the very promises made to the people of Incheon, promises that were being liquidated to pay for the sins of the few. By the time the final months of 2008 arrived, the deception was so deeply embedded that it seemed impossible to excise. The project implementer, the Special Purpose Corporation, began to drift, lost in a sea of litigation and internal strife. The suspicious capital movements had created a hollow shell where a theme park should have been. Every time the auditor turned a page, he felt the ghost of a future that would never happen. The vibrant, robotic wonderland that had been promised in glossy brochures was being replaced by a ledger filled with red ink and hollow excuses. The silence of the construction site at Cheongna was now mirrored in the silence of the boardroom, where the ledger of lies was quietly filed away, hidden from the public eye as the world outside continued to fracture and fall apart. The dream of the robot land was becoming a nightmare of accounting, a story written in the margins of a financial collapse that spared no one, least of all the truth. The transition from grand architectural dreams to the cold reality of a financial autopsy began in the late autumn of 2008. In the heart of Seoul, where the glass towers of the financial district pierced the low, gray clouds of November, a team of investigators gathered in a room that felt too small for the secrets it was about to hold. The air was heavy with the scent of ozone from overworked photocopiers and the lingering, bitter aroma of green tea that had long since gone cold. Outside, the city moved with a frantic neon energy, but inside the audit office, there was only the rhythmic, dry sound of paper being turned. Thousands of pages, thin as onion skin, were stacked in leaning towers across heavy oak desks. These were the skeletal remains of the Robo Dreamland project, a mountain of ledgers and receipts that held the truth about where the people's money had actually gone. The investigators worked in a silence so profound that the ticking of the wall clock felt like a hammer blow against the quiet. They were looking for a phantom, a whisper in the machine that had slowly drained the lifeblood from what was supposed to be the world's first true robotic paradise. As the first week of the audit bled into the second, the investigators found the first loose thread in the tapestry of deception. It was a single-line item in a ledger from early 2008, a payment of 5 billion won to an entity known as the Blue Horizon Development Group. On the surface, it appeared to be a standard procurement contract for specialized hydraulic components. However, when an auditor traced the address listed for Blue Horizon, he didn't find a factory or a bustling office. Instead, the address led to a rusted mailbox in a sleepy industrial district on the outskirts of Incheon, hanging precariously from a chain-link fence. Behind the fence lay nothing but a vacant lot, overgrown with brown, brittle weeds and scattered with the debris of forgotten construction. There were no engineers, no blueprints, and certainly no hydraulic components. This was the first evidence of a shell company, a hollow vessel designed to catch money as it fell through the cracks of the larger project. The team felt a chill that had nothing to do with the failing radiator in the corner of their office. They realized that Blue Horizon was not an anomaly. It was a blueprint for a much larger, much more predatory scheme. By the time December arrived, the investigators had mapped a digital and physical labyrinth that spanned dozens of these ghost entities. They began to refer to the central hub of this network as the Empty Foundation. It was a masterfully constructed web, where money would be transferred from the central Robo Dreamland fund into one company, then immediately split into 3 others, before being funneled into private offshore accounts. The complexity was staggering. One auditor spent 48 hours straight tracking a single sum of 12 billion won. He watched as it vanished into a company called Silver Gear Logistics, then reappeared as a consultancy fee for a firm that specialized in maritime law, despite the project having nothing to do with the sea. The paper trail was like a river that flowed uphill, defying the natural laws of economics. They found that the directors of these shell companies were often the same few individuals, using aliases or the names of distant relatives who had no idea their identities were being used to siphon off the wealth of a nation. The deeper they dug, the more the Dreamland project looked like a hollow shell, a beautiful mask worn by a thief in the night. The physical search for the Empty Foundation's supposed headquarters became a surreal journey through the shadows of the construction industry. In the biting cold of a late December evening, 2 investigators drove to a coastal town where a major research facility was purportedly being built. The GPS led them to a quiet residential street lined with modest, 2-story houses. The address for the Foundation's main administrative hub was a small, darkened apartment above a dry cleaner. There was no signage, no grand entrance, only the smell of chemical solvent and the sound of a distant television. When they knocked on the door, they were met with an empty hallway and the hollow echo of their own footsteps. It was a profound realization. Billions upon billions of won had been funneled through this silent, dusty space. The contrast between the high-tech, futuristic vision of Robo Dreamland and this mundane, crumbling reality was jarring. The Foundation was empty in every sense of the word, devoid of staff, devoid of purpose, and devoid of the grand future it had promised to build for the children of the country. The final report of the audit, compiled as the year 2008 drew to a close, was a damning portrait of systemic greed. It detailed how more than 200 billion won had been effectively erased from the project's accounts through this web of shell companies. The investigators described a process of architectural cannibalism, where the very foundation of the project was eaten away by those entrusted to protect it. They spoke of the exhaustion they felt, the way the numbers began to blur into a singular, unending line of zeros. Each zero represented a school that wouldn't be built, a technology that wouldn't be developed, and a dream that had been sold for the price of a private villa or a secret bank account. As the city celebrated the coming of a new year, the auditors sat in their quiet room, surrounded by the physical evidence of a massive betrayal. The Robo Dreamland project was no longer a symbol of progress. It was a crime scene, and the Empty Foundation was the weapon that had been used to gut it from the inside out. The investigation was far from over, but the illusion had been shattered, leaving only the cold, hard facts in its wake. The air in the interrogation wing was thin and carried the distinct, metallic tang of an aging ventilation system that had not been cleaned in many years. As the year 2008 began to surrender its final months to the biting cold of a harsh winter, the halls of the federal building felt like a subterranean labyrinth, deep and disconnected from the world above. Every footfall echoed against the hard linoleum floors, a rhythmic, hollow sound that seemed to chase the lead developers as they were ushered into small, windowless rooms. The light overhead flickered with a faint, high-pitched buzz, a persistent sound that drilled into the temples of those who sat beneath its sterile glow. The walls were painted a muted, institutional beige, a color designed to offer absolutely no comfort and no distraction from the gravity of the situation. On the heavy oak table in the center of the room sat a single glass of water, the surface of the liquid vibrating ever so slightly each time a heavy door slammed shut somewhere deep down the corridor. The silence here was not peaceful. It was a pressurized weight, pressing against the eardrums of everyone involved in the investigation. One of the lead developers, his eyes rimmed with the heavy, red fatigue of 3 sleepless nights, stared fixedly at the dust motes dancing in the singular beam of a desk lamp. He could hear the distant, muffled roar of the city traffic outside, a reminder of a life that was quickly slipping away. But in this room, the silence was a heavy, suffocating blanket. The investigator sitting across from him did not speak at first. Instead, he slowly and methodically opened a thick, manila folder, the sound of the metal clasp snapping open echoing like a small bone breaking in the quiet. Inside were the physical printouts of the encrypted logs, the secret communications they had called the voices in the vault, which the developers thought had been silenced and deleted forever. The developer's hands, resting on the cold, scarred surface of the table, began to tremble. He remembered the long, frantic hours in the server room, where the constant hum of the cooling fans had sounded like a digital choir, masking the truth of the diverted funds and the carefully manipulated lines of code that had sustained the glittering illusion of Robo Dreamland for so long. Every breath he took felt shallow, as if the very oxygen in the room was being rationed by the authorities. The corruption within the project was not a sudden explosion of greed, but rather a slow, creeping vine that had gradually strangled the integrity of the work from the inside out. In these quiet, claustrophobic rooms, the investigators began to peel back the layers of deception with surgical precision. They spoke at length about the vault, a hidden directory buried deep within the company's private servers, where the true financial metrics and user data were kept, far away from the eyes of the public and the unsuspecting early investors. The lead developers had been promised a digital kingdom, an empire of silicon and imagination. But as the year 2008 reached its somber, freezing conclusion, they found themselves trapped in a prison of their own making. The atmosphere in the interrogation room grew heavy with the scent of stale paper and the faint smell of ozone from a nearby computer terminal. The lead programmer finally spoke, his voice cracking like dry parchment as he described how the pressure to maintain the facade had turned every trusted colleague into a potential enemy. He explained how every single line of code had eventually become a lie, a building block in a cathedral of ghosts that was now collapsing around them in the dark. For the whistleblowers, those brave few who had tried to whisper the truth into the ears of the indifferent months earlier, the legal crackdown brought a different, more complex kind of terror. They remembered the nights spent shivering in the shadows of concrete parking garages, the cold rain of late autumn soaking through their thin coats as they waited for meetings with journalists who often never showed up. They described the haunting sensation of being watched by unseen eyes, the feeling that the very technology they had helped to create was now 1,000 electronic eyes tracking their every movement through the city. One young analyst recounted the way her home phone would ring in the dead of night, only to offer the sound of rhythmic, mechanical breathing on the other end of the line. These voices, which had once been silenced by the crushing weight of corporate non-disclosure agreements and the threat of total ruin, were finally being heard by the grand jury. But the cost of their honesty was written in the deep lines of stress upon their faces and the way they constantly looked over their shoulders, even in the safety of the federal offices. Their stories painted a picture of a company that had traded its soul for a promise of progress that was never intended to be kept. The interrogations continued long into the small hours of the morning, the clock on the wall ticking with a relentless, mechanical precision that seemed to mock the passing of time. Every second felt like a single drop of water falling onto a stone, slowly wearing down the resolve of men who had once believed they were entirely untouchable. The legal teams for the developers sat in the shadows of the room, their expensive wool suits looking strangely out of place in the grim, industrial surroundings. They shuffled through endless stacks of documents, the sound of paper sliding against paper like the rustle of dead leaves in a graveyard. Outside the heavy doors, the world was moving on, oblivious to the quiet, systematic collapse of a digital empire that had once promised to change everything. But inside the vault of the federal building, the truth was finally being exhumed, one painful syllable at a time. The dream of a robotic paradise had ended, replaced by the stark, unforgiving light of justice and the cold reality of the law. As the shadows of 2008 stretched long across the floor, they marked the final end of an era built on nothing but sand, silicon, and the desperate silence of those who knew too much. While the investigators pressed for answers under the flicker of fluorescent lights, the answers themselves lay elsewhere, miles away on the salt-bitten coast, where the Robo Dreamland project had begun to die. The drive out toward the reclamation site was a journey through a landscape of stalled ambitions and hollow promises. In the late hours of 2008, the roads leading to the water were often empty, flanked by vast, dark mudflats that seemed to swallow the very light from the car's headlamps. Inside the cabin of the car, the air was cool, and a thin veil of condensation began to creep up the edges of the windshield, blurring the outside world into a series of gray smudges. The air here was different, heavy with the scent of brine and the sharp, metallic tang of damp earth that has been disturbed and then forgotten. As the vehicle slowed, the tires crunched over loose, gray gravel, a sound that felt violently amplified in the absolute silence of the marshlands. Before me stood the perimeter fence, a towering wall of chain link and rusted barbed wire that hummed softly as the wind caught its mesh, vibrating like a low-frequency warning. It was a boundary between the world that was and the world that had been promised. A high-tech future that had suddenly, inexplicably, ground to a halt as the money began to dry up across the globe. Looking up, the horizon was no longer a clean line between the sea and the sky, but a jagged, terrifying silhouette of skeletal steel. This was the rusting horizon, a nickname whispered by the few locals who still wandered near the restricted site. In the dim, pre-dawn light, the massive frames of what were meant to be gravity-defying attractions rose like the bleached ribcage of prehistoric beasts. There was a roller coaster, its track half completed, ending abruptly in midair as if the builders had simply dropped their heavy tools and walked away in the middle of a shift. The steel, once a gleaming, hopeful silver, had already begun to surrender to the relentless, corrosive salt spray of the Yellow Sea. A fine, orange dust of oxidation coated every single surface, staining the concrete footings and bleeding into the stagnant puddles of rainwater that collected in the deep divots of the earth. The cranes, those towering yellow sentinels of industry, stood frozen in their last positions, their long, spindly arms stretching out over the dark, churning water like beckoning ghosts. The wind whistled through the hollow pipes of the scaffolding, creating a low, mournful flute-like sound that seemed to vibrate in the very marrow of one's bones. a song of abandonment that never quite ended. Inside the innovation pavilions, the stillness was even more profound, a physical weight that pressed against the chest. These were the cavernous spaces meant to house the heart of the project, the research and development labs where the next generation of artificial intelligence was supposed to be born into the world. Pushing open a heavy steel door, the sound of the hinges was a sharp, piercing cry that echoed through the dark interior, bouncing off the high, unfinished ceilings. Inside, the air was stagnant and cold, smelling of ozone, industrial grease, and the peculiar, sterile scent of degraded packing foam. Rows of workbenches sat in perfect, military order, but they were covered in a thick, velvety blanket of gray dust that muffled every footstep. From the ceiling, bundles of multicolored wires hung down like synthetic vines in a mechanical jungle, their copper ends glinting where the insulation had been stripped away by scavengers or time. There were no lights here, only the occasional beam of a flashlight cutting through the gloom, revealing the outlines of high-end computer terminals and heavy hydraulic presses that had never once been powered on. The floors were littered with discarded blueprints, their blue ink fading to a ghostly, unreadable pale under the touch of the damp air, the edges curling and brittle like dead autumn leaves. In the furthest, darkest corner of the future robot hall, the dream took on a more haunting and visceral shape. Here, the residents of the park waited in their wooden crates, never to be unpacked. These were the animatronics, the half-finished visions of a robotic utopia that was supposed to change the way humans lived. A long row of humanoid torsos stood on metal stands, their inner workings exposed to show the intricate, silver clockwork of pistons and servos that were meant to mimic the fluid, breathing grace of human movement. Some had been fitted with their silicone skins, a pale, translucent material that felt eerily like cold, damp flesh to the touch, still smelling faintly of the chemicals used in the molding process. One figure, a guide meant to greet children at the gate, sat slumped in a plastic chair, its head tilted at an impossible, broken angle. It had no eyes yet, only empty, dark sockets that seemed to stare with a profound, mechanical sadness at the unfinished concrete walls. The silence of these machines was different from the silence of the building. It was the silence of a heartbeat that had never been allowed to start. The hands of another robot, delicately articulated with dozens of tiny, brass joints, remained outstretched toward the door, frozen in a permanent, desperate gesture of offering to a crowd of visitors that would never arrive. The year 2008 had brought with it a winter that chilled much more than just the skin of the workers. As the global financial markets trembled and collapsed, the flow of capital that had fueled this ambitious city of the future simply evaporated into the mist. The $700 billion that had been promised for the project became nothing more than a haunting figure on a ledger that no one had the courage to sign. The Robo Dreamland was no longer a symbol of progress or national pride, but a monument to a sudden, jarring pause in the march of history. Standing there, on the very edge of the rusting horizon, one could almost feel the weight of the stalled clocks and the vanished dreams. The hope of a robot in every household had been replaced by the grim reality of a rusted bolt, a shattered window, and a torn, mud-stained blueprint. As the first gray, watery light of morning began to creep over the horizon, the skeletal structures of the park seemed to dissolve into the thickening fog, becoming nothing more than a memory of a future that had been canceled before it could begin. The wind picked up, rattling the loose corrugated panels of the research building, a rhythmic metallic tapping that sounded like a message in code. A warning, perhaps, that some dreams are simply too heavy for the fragile earth to carry. The courtroom in the late autumn of 2009 felt less like a hall of justice, and more like a tomb carved from polished mahogany and cold, unyielding marble. The air was thick, heavy with the scent of floor wax, and the faint, metallic tang of an aging ventilation system that hummed a low, discordant note beneath the proceedings. Across the room, The executives of Robo Dreamland sat in a rigid row. Their expensive wool suits, which once signaled power and progress, now looked thin and fragile against the immense weight of the evidence. I remember the way the light from the tall, narrow windows caught the dancing dust motes, making them look like tiny, frantic stars trapped in a space where time had simply stopped. The chief executive officer, a man who had once promised a future where machines and humans walked hand in hand, stared at the scarred surface of the defense table. His hands, once used to grandly gesture toward architectural models and glowing blueprints, were now folded tightly, the knuckles a stark, bloodless white. There was a profound silence in that room, a silence that seemed to stretch back to the abandoned construction sites and the empty warehouses where the silicon dreams of a generation had been left to rot. Every breath taken by the gallery felt like a shared secret, a collective inhalation before the final fall of the gavel. Judge Evelyn Thorne moved with a deliberate, slow grace as she adjusted her spectacles. The sound of her pen scratching against a pad of yellow paper was the only thing that broke the stillness for what felt like hours. When she finally spoke, her voice was like dry parchment, thin, but carrying a sharpness that cut through the lingering fog of the defense's final arguments. She began to read the sentences, detailing the systematic dismantling of hope that had occurred under the banner of Robo Dreamland. For the counts of wire fraud, securities manipulation, and the embezzlement of over $40 million, the sentences were uncompromising. The chief executive officer was sentenced to 15 years in a federal penitentiary, a number that seemed to hang in the air like a physical weight. The chief financial officer, the architect of the shadow accounts and the ghost companies, received 12 years. As the words were spoken, a woman in the third row of the gallery began to weep quietly. She was one of the hundreds of subcontractors who had been ruined when the project collapsed in the winter of 2008. Her tears were silent, soaking into a threadbare velvet scarf, a reminder that while the executives faced years in a cell, the families they had exploited faced a lifetime of rebuilding from nothing. The justice delivered was cold, measured in years and restitution orders that could never truly replace the years of life lost to stress and the hollow ache of a stolen future. Miles away from the sterile environment of the courthouse, the physical remains of the dream lay surrendered to the elements. The site once known as Robo Dreamland had become a landscape of rust and regret. If you were to walk through those rusted iron gates today, you would hear the wind whistling through the hollow ribcages of half-finished animatronic giants. The skeletons of these machines, crafted from high-grade steel and intricate hydraulics, now stand as monuments to hubris. The ground is a carpet of red dust and discarded silicon. Thousands of microchips, intended to be the brains of a new world, lie scattered in the dirt like the shimmering scales of a dead mechanical beast. They crunch beneath your boots with a sound like breaking glass, a fragile, high-pitched protest against the weight of the present. The smell of the air here is distinct. It is the scent of damp earth mixed with the ozone of oxidized copper and the sour tang of decaying plastic. In the center of what was meant to be the Hall of Tomorrow, a single robotic arm hangs suspended from a crane, swaying gently in the breeze. It looks like a limb reaching out for a hand that will never come to guide it. The silicon, once the most precious resource of the digital age, is now just another part of the silt, washing away with every heavy rain into the forgotten corners of the industrial park. There is no music here, no laughter of children, only the rhythmic creaking of metal on metal as the park slowly settles into the earth. We often think of crimes as sudden eruptions of violence, but the crime of Robo Dreamland was a slow, creeping erosion. It was the theft of a collective imagination. In the year 2008, when the world felt as though it were tilting off its axis, these men offered a vision of a stable, automated paradise. They sold a future that they knew would never arrive, using the very tools of progress to build a house of cards. The human cost is not just found in the bank statements or the court transcripts. It is found in the quiet desperation of the engineers who poured their souls into designs that were never meant to function. It is found in the silence of the towns that expected a technological renaissance and were left with a graveyard of wires and glass. As the sun sets over the ruins of the park, the long shadows of the cranes stretch across the valley like fingers pointing toward the horizon. The silicon chips catch the last light of the evening, sparking for a brief, deceptive moment before the darkness swallows them whole. The deception was grand, the fallout was devastating, and the silence that remains is the most honest thing about the entire endeavor. It is a silence that tells the truth about what happens when greed is disguised as innovation, and when the dreams of the many are sacrificed for the luxury of the few. The machines will never wake, the gates will never open, and the red dust will continue to settle over the silicon until the two are indistinguishable from one another. The echoes of the courtroom have finally faded, replaced by the soft, rhythmic breathing of a world moving on. The story of Robo Dreamland is now a chapter in a dusty ledger, a cautionary tale whispered in the corridors of finance and the workshops of inventors. We leave the rusted steel and the shattered glass behind us now. The wind has died down, and the shadows have stretched into a deep, velvety black that covers the scars on the landscape. There is a strange kind of peace in the finality of it all, the knowledge that the storm has passed and the secrets have all been told. Let the weight of the story lift from your shoulders. The world is quiet, the night is still, and the complexity of the silicon and the struggle of the dust are no longer your burden to carry. Feel the softness of your blankets and the stillness of the air around you. The story is complete. The case rests now. Let the details fade. You are safe. Close your eyes, breathe deeply, and have a good night. Sleep well.